Again, here we are about how to overcome the corruptions of the world. And we've been talking about the 5 turbiddities. Talking about the turbiddities of mundane beings that primarily deals with morality of beings, human beings. And that took us to the 10 precepts. We've gone through all 9 precepts. Today will be the last precept of this 10 pillars of Buddhism. You can say the 10 foundations of Buddhism. The 10 precept here is abstention from false view. The positive counterpart is wisdom, to cultivate wisdom. So what is meant by false view and how can be abandoned? That is our objective today, is to understand what false views are, how to cultivate right views, and how to abandon false view to cultivate right views. False views, this term here, in sense, it's called Miccha Ditti. Miccha means wrong or false. 打经打 or 邪见邪. Yeah, it's not meaning, it's in translation, Chinese translation, it's not straight, it's crooked. And Ditti here means belief or view. So in other words, wrong view, right? You're not seeing things properly. That could either be a belief, a dogma of theory, false theory, groundless or unfounded opinion. Well, which will not lead us to the truth, to happiness, but it will lead us to suffering. So the first thing is that it's wrong because of the, in a sense that it's seeing things wrongly. For example, in meditation, when one practices meditation without a proper meditation, without getting to wisdom. For example, in deep meditation, one observes the spirit of the passing of a cow. So when a cow dies, he sees the spirits rising up into heaven. So he then arrives at the conclusion, a wrong conclusion, that the cause of heavenly birth is living like a cow. So he lives an austere life of a cow, right? So he lives like a cow, hoping to get to heaven. So that's wrong view. So some people, when they enter deep meditation, they can see certain things, and based on what they observe, they think that's the truth, but that's not the truth. So they say, oh, if I live like a cow, I can go to heaven because that cow, that spirit is now in heaven, enjoying heavenly bliss. So I want to have heavenly bliss as well. So therefore, if I live like a cow, then that will lead me to heaven. But that's wrong. That's wrong view, right? So the proper way of thinking is that the cause of heavenly birth is by performing virtuous deeds, right? It's not living like a cow, but to do good deeds, to do virtuous deeds. In the Dhammapada, Kinh Pháp Cú, Pháp Chư Kinh, there was a verse about the cause of heavenly birth. A follower of a Buddha, his sister passed away, and he asked the Buddha where his sister was going to be, and the Buddha says that she has been reborn in the Tasita heavens. And so the Buddha says that anybody who is heedful, meaning they have mindfulness, whether it's a monastic, a monk, or a lay person, that he can rejoice both in this world and in the world beyond, meaning after death. So the operative word here is heedful. So it's not just about doing good deeds, but be mindful in your good deeds to perform the virtuous deeds. So the person who has done good and virtuous deeds rejoices in this world, and then after death, he rejoices exceedingly in the world beyond. So it's not just about living like a cow, right? But to do virtuous deeds. So that's the proper way of seeing things, right? So that's right view. Another way is to say, to have a wrong view is, I was born a Buddhist. Well, that's wrong because being a Buddhist means that you take refuges in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? Quy y Tam Bảo, Quy y San Bảo. So it's not that you're born into a family and you become a Buddhist. No, you become a Buddhist because you take refuges in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and you observe the 5 precepts. Ngũ giới, tam quy ngũ giới, right? San quy wu jie, right? So that is the wrong view to say, oh, I'm a Buddhist. And just because I was born into a Buddhist family. This is in the Middle Discourses scriptures, Middle Discourse scriptures. The Buddha talked about this. There was a discussion between two people about how to become a Brahmin, a Parliament, Balamon. We should understand that by Brahmin here, the Buddha did not mean the state, did not mean the caste system, like a social caste system. But what he was referring to was the state of purity, enlightenment, and liberation, right? So when he say in the scriptures, we see this term a lot, Parliament, Balamo, right? We see this term a lot in Brahmin. But in many cases, we should not understand the Brahmin here to be a caste system, but it represents purity, it represents enlightenment. So one person was saying, the two people were arguing of what is meant to be a Brahmin. One says that, well, you become a Brahmin because both of your mother's side and your father's side are Brahmins, and that your ancestry goes back to the 7th generation. Go back to 7th generation. So because of that you are born a Brahmin. But the other person did not agree. He said, when you are ethical and accomplished in doing your duties, then you are Brahmin. They couldn't convince each one another the definitions of a Brahmin, how to become a Brahmin. So they brought this matter to the Buddha to have this matter settled. The Buddha explained to these two people that by giving a very thorough explanation. First, he started with the taxonomy of living creatures. He started to label the creatures from low to high to say, how do you know that you are a Brahmin? How do you know that you are such and such category? The Buddha says, well, if you know that grass and trees, they lack self-awareness, right? They don't have that self-awareness, and therefore you can define them by birth. So a plant or something similar without awareness, you can say that they are plants, they are in that group. Or if you see bugs and moths and so on, you can define them by birth. Or like fish, because they live in water, you can say they're fish, right? They may look different, but they are fish, they are one category. Or any animals with flying wings, then you can say they're a category of birds. And that means that you can define it by birth. So a person or a being that's born into that group, you can say, yeah, that group, it's defined by that group. You following me so far, right? So the Buddha is trying to explain, how is it a person born into a Brahmin family, not a Brahmin? So the Buddha was giving different examples, analogies to help us understand. So he said that the differences between humans and animals is that because humans, we have a little bit more of self-awareness, that we are not really defined by birth. We're not defined by the way that we wear our hair, the clothes that we put on our bodies. And that's this distinction, that usually the distinctions among humans are spoken of by convention. So for example, if a person who raises cattle is called a farmer and not a Brahmin, not an enlightened person, right? A person who lives off by various professions, then they are professionals. They're not Brahmins. A person who lives off priesthood, they are not Brahmin. They are just like a sacrificial. So the Buddha says that I don't call somebody a Brahmin after the mother or wound they came from. If they still have attachment, then they are just someone, they may be a professional. You can call them sirs, but they are not Brahmin. By Brahmin, I call them a Brahmin if they have nothing, taking nothing, cutting off all feathers, they become detached, then I call that person Brahmin. So the Buddha is defining what a Brahmin means, right? Bà La Môn, người Bà La Môn, a Parliament. He said that without a person without anger and who performs dutifully in observing the precepts, who understand themselves at the end, how to end suffering and achieving the highest goal. So the Buddha is going beyond self-awareness. First, we have a group of no lack of self-awareness, like animals, plants. And then we have some professionals who have some sort of self-awareness. And then we have another group called transcendental awareness. That's what the Buddha is referring to as Brahman, a person who is pure, who is enlightened, who no longer has attachment, no longer has anger, right? So being free from all feathers, worldly attachment and suffering, right, and achieving the highest goal, that is a state of spiritual liberation. And that requires transcendental awareness. Right? So the Buddha is saying, just because you're born into in a sense, a Buddhist family, doesn't mean that you are Buddhist. You are Buddhist because you have taken refuges in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, right? And you observe the 5 precepts. You are truly a Buddhist. Does it make sense? Right? So a person who, like a Buddhist or a pure person, will not be killing, will not be taking things from others, will not have greed, will not have hatred. And they've given up all human bonds, even heavenly bonds. So a person who is transcendental goes beyond the human bonds and the heavenly bonds. So what that means is a person who is who still has the 5 desires, ngũ dục, right? Tài sắc danh thực thùy, right? Ủ duy, tài sơ miễn, shì shui. Desires are wealth, sex, fame, food, drinks, and rest. So so anybody who is still within the realm of the 5 desires will be bonded to the human realm. But one step higher is the heavenly bond, and the Buddha called these, even though there's joy in heaven, but a person who is stuck with heavenly joy, then he is still within the heavenly bond restriction. And the Buddha called these bonds because they tie sentient beings to the cycle of life and death. They can never escape suffering. They can never achieve true happiness. We should understand this a little bit deeper to avoid being fooled and to have misunderstanding. I'll give you an example. There was a report on June 8th, last month, right, early last month, about a mega church leader who was sentenced to more than 16 years in a California prison for sexually abusing young female followers who said he made them his sex slaves. So they were his close and devout followers, and they were told, that being his sex slaves would lead to their salvation, to their liberation, and damnation if they refuse. So in other words, if they refused, they would go to hell. If they became his sex slaves, then they would go to heaven. Of course, he was found guilty. And the judge said this, and I quote, "I never stop to be amazed at what people do in the name of religion and how many lives are ruined in the guise of a supreme being." So people just follow, and they get trapped, and they feel guilty for leaving. They feel guilty for not obliging, and their lives become ruined. So anyways, what I'm trying to say here is anybody who claims to be godly, heavenly, no matter how revered and famous they are, but if they still have attachment to the 5 desires, right? Wealth, sex, fame, food, drinks, and rest, then they are just mundane beings. Right? Somebody who is famous, this guy had like 5 million followers. Right? He's part of this mega church, big organization. And people thought of him as a god. But we know that he is not, because he is still within the human bonds, right? It's still a human realm. So we know that he's just a mundane being, because he still has the desires for wealth, sex, fame, food, drinks, and rest, the 5 desires. And then going one step further is, even if somebody who is truly heavenly, because they have achieved a certain level of cultivation, but because they are stuck to the heavenly joy, they're not willing to step out of their comfort zone to help others, then they are just, again, mundane human beings as well. Maybe mundane heavenly beings, right? Not transcendental. Of course, this is by the Buddha standard. So the Buddha standard is saying, to be transcendental, you have to go beyond the human bonds and the heavenly bonds. Does it make sense? Right? So that's one way of gauging whether we have the right view, we're on the right path or not, is, are we moving beyond the human bonds and the heavenly bonds? And are we free of attachment? And we should be free of attachment if we want to be in the transcendental level. And the Buddha continues, for a long time, this misconception has prejudiced those who don't understand. Ignorant, they declare that one is a Brahmin by birth. So, while the Buddha was transcendental, he was still very realistic. He's saying here that this misconception has caused a lot of social injustice. He was a social reformer that the world had ever seen. Nobody there to challenge the thousands years of tradition, the caste systems. He was willing to challenge the caste system without fear of assassination, without fear of being killed. And many had tried to kill the Buddha, but they could not kill the Buddha, because the Buddha's merits are so great that nobody can kill the Buddha. And how do you know that? Well, we look at the Vinaya Pitaka. The Buddha says that he cannot be killed by any human or heaven beings. In the Luk Tang, in the Vinaya Pitaka, Li Zhang, right? He said to the monks, it is impossible, bhikkhus. It cannot happen that anyone can take a perfect one's life by violence. So his merits are so great that nobody can even touch him. Nobody can really kill him. But when he was a bodhisattva, yes, he could be hurt. But as long as a person who has become a perfect one becomes a Buddha, when he becomes a Buddha, then he cannot be touched. He cannot be killed, because the merits are so great, right? So that's why the Buddha was not fearful in speaking out, in saving sentient beings, in helping sentient beings to achieve liberation. Because when you achieve liberation, you are helping them to move beyond their realm, and somebody is controlling them, right? When you help them move out, that means those in control are losing control. Of course, they're going to fight, but the Buddha was not afraid of such harm, because he was so great in his merits. So he said that you are not a Brahmin by birth, nor by birth a non-Brahmin. So it doesn't mean, in other words, just because you are born in a Buddhist family, that does not make you a Buddhist. And just because you are not born in a Buddhist family, that doesn't mean that you cannot become a Buddhist. Right? Said differently, whether you are born in a Buddhist family or not, you can still achieve spiritual liberation. All right. So your destiny, your spiritual liberation is not defined by your birth, but is your commitment, is your motivation to achieve a state of spiritual liberation. Just like a farmer is defined by his deeds, or by your profession. You can be defined by your profession, a farmer, a trader, an engineer, and so forth. But when you have gone beyond that, there is nothing that can define you. You define yourself. Right? You're an individual. You're not a unit in a mass. You have your own individuality. And he said here, by austerity and spiritual practice. By austerity, he means discipline. When we have self-discipline, we have spiritual practice, we have self-control, then we become a Brahmin. I mean, an enlightened person, right? A pure person with accomplishments in the three knowledges. And so the two people that came to the Buddha asking the question felt delighted in the answer, and they were able to get the answers to the questions. So it should be clear by now that by Brahmin, the Buddha was not referring to the caste system, but the spirit of it, right? The spirit of spiritual liberation, the purity, and enlightenment, right? So that's going back to wrong view and right view. Is sometimes we think that we're right, but we're not. We have to really go back and to the scriptures to have a proper understanding of our view. The second, so that was the first one, with the seeing things wrongly, understanding things wrongly. The second thing that was considered as wrong, so in the second place, a wrong or false view as expressed more or less systematically in intellectual terms in the form of a doctrine. Just because it's a teaching, it doesn't mean that it's right. Just because that it has been accepted by a wide community, even a scientific community, doesn't mean that it is right. So let's take a look at this. René Descartes, he was a great philosopher for over 400 years, and a lot of science was leveraging his knowledge and his teaching. He believed that the soul, he called a soul inside the body, was just a ghost in the machine. He saw that there was a separation between the body and the soul, and that the brain had nothing to do with the soul, or the body had nothing to do with the soul. But recent development in science has proven otherwise. So according to recent development with neuroscience, how the brain works, it says that each time you move your finger, or to play a piano or to play something, you move your body parts, you are changing your brain, the connectivities in your brain. Descartes was saying that your body and your soul were two different things. René argued that the mind and brain are different substances and are governed by different laws. And the brain, he referred to as the physical, material things obeying the physical law, but the mind, he called it the soul, immaterial. So to him, there were two separate things that had no relation. And this human beings consist of this duality, dominated science for 400 years. So for a long, long time, right? People believe that his philosophy was correct. But however, he could never credibly explain how the immaterial mind could influence the material mind. And as a result, people began to doubt that immaterial thought may change the structure of the brain. So meaning that your thinking, he said, was different from your physical body, that the two had no relation, no connection. Descartes' view seems to open an unbridgeable gap between brain and mind. His noble attempt to rescue the brain from mysticism in his time by making it mechanical failed. Instead, the brain came to be seen as an inert, inanimate machine that could be moved to action only by immaterial ghosts like soul. So he called this the ghost in the machine. And by depicting a mechanistic brain, Descartes drained the life out of it, slowed the acceptance of brain plasticity more than any other thinker. So he really led many scientists down the wrong path. Due to recent development, we now know that our immaterial thoughts have a physical signature. So when you move your hands, you are causing changes in your brain that scientists 400 years ago were not able to observe. But now with machines and CAT scan, you can see the changes in the brain. So but there's still more to go though. We have yet to understand exactly how thoughts actually change the brain structure. But it is clear that they do change the brain structure. So just because something that has been around for a long time, that it is true, right? But it's not necessarily the case. So that's an example of wrong view where just because it's an established systematic doctrine teaching does not mean that it is right. Another example is about free will. Sir Charles Sherrington in 1895, he used the afferentation. The afferentation is a surgical procedure to cut the incoming sensory nerves in your body parts. In this case, they were experimenting with monkeys. So they cut the nerves so that the nerves will not be connected to your spinal cord. So the result was that without inputs, the afferented monkeys could not feel any sensation or pain when touched. So because you cut the nerves, there's no connection. So when you touch something, you cannot feel the pain because your nerves are now cut and there's supposedly no connection to your spinal cord. So all movements occur in response to some stimulus. So this is called reflexology. Reflexology says that we move not because of our brains commanding it, but because our spinal reflexes keep us moving. So in other words, when you walk, it is not because you want to walk, but because of the reflexes that propels you forward. This theory was soon used to explain all of movement. Other thinkers soon generalized Sherrington's idea. All of movement, even complex behavior, is built up from chains of reflexes. According to this theory, free will is an illusion. You want to move to your desired location, not because you want to, but because of the reflexes they claimed. This became standard teaching in medical schools and universities for 75 years. So a really long time, right? 75 years. Science students believed that this was the case. Then came his student, Sherrington's own student, Edward Top. He's still alive today. What he did was he cut one arm. One arm of a monkey was the afferented, but the nerves were cut, and the monkey couldn't use it. But then he did something else. He decided to cut both the nerves in both arms of the monkey. But then he found that the monkey could now use both arms, which was strange because according to Sherrington, the monkeys couldn't move, couldn't feel to move the arms. So, but then he did only one with one arm. What Edward Topp did was he cut both the nerves in both arms. When he cut one the nerves in one arm, the monkey could not use that arm. So I said, okay, maybe Sherrington was right. But then he decided to take one step further. He cut the other nerve, the nerves in the other arm. But then the monkey was able to now use both arms, which was strange. So, but because you would expect the monkey could not use the arms at all, right? Because the nerves were cut. There was no stimuli to activate the arms. What happened was that when one arm was deafferented, meaning the nerves were cut, the monkey started to use the good arm and stopped using the bad arm. So so the monkey stopped using the arms, and that's why he was not able to move the arm. But when both arms were cut, what happened was that the monkey had to learn how to use the arms to survive. So it was forcing itself to move the arm to pick up food to feed itself, right? And that's when he came to an epiphany, another understanding of what was happening. So what he did was then he deafferented the whole spinal cord, so that there was not a single spinal reflex left in the body. And the monkey could not receive sensory input from any limbs at all, just to minimize any doubt. So he cut the entire spinal cord, the back, everything, no inputs. The result was that the monkey was still able to use its limbs, which was amazing because that went against Sherrington's theory, which was had been accepted for 75 years. So Sherrington's reflexological theory was dead, was proven wrong. So Topp's he called this constraint-induced CI therapy. So before we conclude, I want to say something a little bit more of this. So what he found was that with CI therapy, constraint-induced therapy, he was able to use this to treat stroke patients. Usually when a person has a stroke, the half side of their body is paralyzed, essentially, right? And so they could not use their arms or their leg. And so what happens with that, when it happened, about a few months, about 3 to 6 months, it was going through a shock, a spinal shock. And the body was not recognizing that, the brain was not recognizing that there was this part of the body that was existing. And Topp was using this to help people to recover. So what he did was that during that time, most people will give up in using the body. They stop using that half side of the body and then they become paralyzed because they stop using the body. But he found that if you continue to use the body, you continue to make it train the arms to move again, pick up things and do the regular things that you do, you will be able to retrain the body. So it's not completely dead. So what happened is the first 3 to 6 months, the patient is accepting that, oh, my body is paralyzed. So he stops using that half of the body. And because he's not using it, he is losing it. But what Topp found was that with therapy, that the patient, he would constrain the good arm and force the patient to use the bad arm, the damaged arm, and to train the damaged arm. Right? So at first, the stroke patient will have difficulty to try to move his arm. But without positive reinforcement, he gives up. And so instead, he relies on the good arm, and he's not using the bad arm anymore. And so he's losing that part of the body. So you don't use it, you lose it. And so the spinal shock period can last for several months. So you have to be diligent, 坚忍, 坚持, to train. You have to be diligent and determined to train the bad arm, to retrain it essentially, because you have damage in your nerves. So the stroke patient needs to keep training the affected limb during this critical period, or 3 to 6 months, just after a stroke. The person needs to continue to try very hard to train the damaged body part, right? That limb. So by constraining the use of good arm and forcing the effective arm to work, to exercise, to move, then he can recover. So that's what Top found was, he called this constraint-induced therapy, which has been to be very effective. So somebody who has a stroke, encourage them to use the bad arm. It will be very difficult, because it's like you never had that arm before, and so it will feel very strange, very foreign to them. But encourage them to continue to exercise, continue to move the hand, and it will become better to overcome that critical period. So it's not permanent. So that's what he found with that. It is not permanent, but it is changeable. Okay? So what I'm trying to say here is that just because it's a systematic teaching and it may have been accepted for hundreds of years, it does not mean that it is right? Let's go through another example here where the Buddha explains what this all means. This is a story about blind man and the elephant, to show that without wisdom, you will not be able to see things properly. So there was a certain king who called together all the blind men in the city, and then had an elephant presented to them, and then the king asked them what they thought what an elephant was. They were all blind, so an elephant was brought into the room with the blind man, and the king asked them to feel the elephant and to describe to the king what an elephant was to them. Some was feeling the tusk, thinking that it was hard and sharp on the end. Some was feeling its trunk, thinking that it's flexible like a hose. One person was feeling the belly, thinking that it's a big, like a big pot. Someone was feeling the ears, thinking that it was just like a basket of some sort. So they gave to them. They were convinced of their understanding of what an elephant was, and they were arguing against each other, even come to a fight, to trying to convince the others of what they were, what they knew of what an elephant was. And of course, the king was sitting there and he laughed, because they were being ridiculous, fighting over each other, trying to describe what an elephant was. So what does this all mean? What does this parable mean? And what is the elephant? What does the elephant represent? In this case, you can say that the elephant represents life, or it represents the nature of existence, or the truth, you can say. What about the blind man? Who are they? What do they represent? The blind men are the founders of different philosophical systems. They are blind because they have no prana, no wisdom, right? They come up with different philosophical systems, and they thought that they were that the system was the truth, the ultimate, but because they had no prana, that they could not see. And they could not appreciate the true nature of existence. Just like the blind man cannot see the elephant in its entirety. The founders of the different philosophical systems they were incorrect. What they thought they have derived at their philosophical systems were not correct. Their descriptions may not be absolutely wrong, but they were not correct, right? The tusk, the tusk is part of the elephant, right? The tusks were also part of the elephant. An elephant had a big belly, so that was part of the elephant too. But they claimed that the big belly was the entire elephant, which was not correct. But the views given by the founders of the different philosophical systems were very one-sided and misleading. So it was not that they were not correct, but because of they think that what they knew was the entirety, that's where they were incorrect. Right? Although the blind man cannot see the elephant, the king can see it, and he can see the whole elephant. What does the king represent? The king here represents the Buddha. The Buddha is able to see the true nature of existence because he has prana, border, right? Bhagnya, because he has wisdom. Just as the king is able to see the whole elephant because he has two good eyes. He can see clearly what an elephant is. So from this story that we can understand how important wisdom is in Buddhism in order to avoid wrong views, having wrong views, right? So without prana, we cannot see the true nature of existence. These blind men represent the founders of different philosophical systems, but and they saw only a portion of it being true, not the entirety of the truth. There are three, and these blind men represent three categories of wrong view. The first category is called, in English we call it deism. Deism means belief in a personal God, a person who has a supreme being who has created the whole world, the whole universe, everything. He can create anything and everything, but he himself is not created by anybody. So that's deism. According to deism, God is eternal. God is almighty. He knows everything. He sees everything. He sees everything. And he has not only created the universe, he also governs it and rules it by his will. So there is nothing that can happen without God. So compared to God, man is weak, helpless, and powerless. Man cannot do anything. So that's deism. And that's wrong view. But there are people, even today, believe in that theory. Second is pantheism. Pantheism is belief in an impersonal God. So that's the other extreme. One is a personal God who he creates everything. And the other is impersonal God who is identified with the universe. So everything is God, right? Tree is God, stone is God, this microphone is God, everything is God. According to pantheism, in the beginning, everything comes out of God, and in the end, everything goes back to God. So that's pantheism. That's the other extreme view, and that is wrong view. The third category is materialism. Nothing exists except material. So this body here that we have, this life, it's just a coincidence that when we pass on, there is nothing left. This body is just material. There is no such thing as mind. There is no consciousness, apart from matter. The mind, the body, it just matter. It's all matter. There is nothing else other than matter. Right? The mind is just a byproduct of matter. Just as butter is a byproduct of milk. That to them, that's their view. That's materialism. All these three philosophical systems are what Buddhism calls wrong view. Right? They're wrong they're mistaken. They're mistaken. They are one-sided. They don't represent the entire truth. That's why they're wrong. And a man without prana, without wisdom, are spiritually blind and have no personal experience of the true nature of existence. Here's the second category is just because something that has been accepted for hundreds of years, some teachings that has been accepted for hundreds of years or even thousands of years, it does not mean that it is correct. Because they may be correct in a certain time, certain place, but not in its entirety in the universe. And the emphasis here is that one needs to have wisdom in order to have the right view. Right? What makes the view or doctrine wrong or false is because it's when it's contaminated by covetousness, hatred, tham, right? Tham, lòng tham, anger. So I know it's greed and anger, and as well as delusion. So with anger, cravings, false speech, killing, sexual misconduct, one leads a life of falsehood and in delusion. This is why one has wrong view, because of all those contaminants. To have the right view, one will have to correct one's life away. And that's why we have to learn Buddhism in order to correct our view, in order to avoid wrong view. Only that view is samyak, or right or true, or perfect, is a mental state of uncontaminated by covetousness, hatred, and delusion. The enlightened consciousness, which sees things as they really are, not simply in the sense of being the opposite of wrong or false view. So we should understand that the right view in Buddhism is not between wrong and right, but it really surpasses wrong and right. Some say that this right view is also non-view because it's not being biased, right? It has gone above the relativity between wrong and right. So that's why it has no view. It's not biased, right or wrong. Because what's right to you may be wrong to me, or what's, vice versa, right? What's right to you may not be right to some other people. So Buddhism has gone above that relativity between wrong and right. So right view is non-view in a sense that it is not held with conviction of some absolute righteousness. It's like some people, right, when they're born into like a Brahmin family, they think that they are Brahmins. They think that what they do is right, but it's not. But they feel justified for being who they are just because they are born in that tradition. But Buddhism goes beyond that. So through those seeing things as they really are, one has a critical awareness. So when we learn Buddhism, we should see that Buddhism is just a raft that takes us from one place to the other. So once you're on to the other shore, you don't need a raft anymore. But you don't destroy the raft either, right? When you're over to the shore, it may not be of any use to you, but you don't destroy the raft. You allow it for other people to use it. Meaning that we learn Buddhism, we understand Buddhism now. We should share with other people. We should protect it. We should share it so that other people can benefit too, not just say, oh, everything is emptiness, I don't need it, so therefore I'm going to destroy it. When we learn something, even though it's not absolute, it's just an experience, but we should preserve it because it may be useful to other people. In the scriptures, Kunda, the silversmith, asked about false view, and the Buddha explains what it means by false view. He said that a person with false view holds the following thinking: that there is no gift, no offerings, there's no fruit or ripening of good deeds, there's not this world, no world beyond this, no beings supernaturally born, no recluses or Brahmins in the world who have done right by their own comprehension that they realize this world. So what this means is that by no gift and no offering, meaning that to put in effort. Some people think that, oh, after life, this life, there is nothing else. What's the point in working so hard? You just enjoy life, because after this life, there is nothing. Because a wrong view that a person will see that there, or at least a person thinks that there are no consequences to their actions. There is no higher spiritual values, and no possibility of anyone personally realizing the ultimate truth of things. So when a person does not recognize that and can only see this life, then that person has wrong view, because they don't recognize that their actions have consequences. They don't see a higher values of spiritual cultivation, and they don't believe that anybody can be perfect, anybody can achieve ultimate enlightenment. That inhibition will cause them to have false view. So false views, in a way, they will deny of any moral and spiritual life, and they don't see the importance of observing the 10 precepts. Why live morally? Right? That's wrong view. So there are two categories that the right view avoids. One is nihilism. The other is externalism or existentialism. So when we can avoid these two views, then we have right view. So what is right view? In the Sutra Nikaya, A Hán Chính, Kinh A Hàm, the Buddha, Venerable Kakayana, said to the Blessed One, people say right view, Lord, but how should right view be defined? How do we know that we have right view? So the Buddha explains to the Venerable that this world mostly relies on the economy of existence and completeness existence. Those two extreme views. One sees that the world as really is, not have the idea of complete non-existence. So non-existence here is nihilism, right? 断见, 断见. The other is the idea of real existence. So those are the two extremes the Buddha says. The world is mostly bound up with attachment. If one does not embrace or have attachment, and is not fixated on thinking about myself, this ego, then he will understand about the nature of dukkha, essentially. If you're not attached to any side, then you will have a better understanding of nature. Because dissatisfaction or dukkha, suffering, is not real. It's just an experience that based on conditions, right? Our happiness, our suffering, they're not real. Those are just experiences. They're not real. They're based on conditions. Everything exists is one extreme. Everything does not exist is the other extremes. So avoiding these extremes, you will come to the middle path, and you'll be able to avoid ignorance. Because of ignorance that we have formations. So our ignorance or delusion drives us towards unskillful motivation or volition. So volition is the force that continues turning the wheel of cycle of life and death. So to stop the cycle of life and death, you have to stop this volition, right? Han, un, xing, yun. We should understand this a little bit more, that the Buddha was not explaining philosophical theory to Kakayana. His middle way was a way of thinking about reality that helps bring to an end of suffering. So it's not wishing for annihilation, that you don't suffer anymore, or wishing to live forever, that you have joy, but to understand it, to end suffering by understanding. Okay. And usually, if we don't have awareness, we don't find out about suffering until it's too late. So every day that we experience, every moment, we are building this momentum with false understanding that leads to suffering. And most people don't recognize suffering until suffering occurs. And by then it's too late. Right? So the Buddha is trying to help us to prevent suffering from forming at the start, to have right view. So that's what the problem is, that we usually are not aware of this thing, and we allow it to form, to take momentum, to build momentum, and by then it is too late. Give an example, for example, to make this more concrete so we can understand this a little bit more clearly. These two extreme views we experience every day without wisdom, and we don't even know it. For example, like stress. We experience stress, and it is not just a philosophical matter, but some people believe that it really exists. And if we don't have awareness of ourselves, we think that our stress exists. That's why we become angry, agitated, because we think our stress is really real. So this stress, this word, exists independently, separate from other words like tiredness and overwork, because we see it as real. We don't correlate that we're stressed out because we are overworked or we're tired, but we think our stress is really real, and therefore we start to take unskillful actions. So that is 常见, thường經. That is eternalism, to believe that stress really exists, right? But in reality, stress does not exist. It only exists conditionally. So we think that this stress has its self-existence. It exists on its own, and now it's attacking us, and we want it to go away. So we believe that stress exists, and so we are fighting to make it go away. Right? This leads us to think that our stress has some kind of thing that exists in a definite, solid way. So we think that stress really exists. And so what happens is that we're not aware of this. We swing to the other extreme, and we wish stress to not exist. So, right, we start with existentialism, and then we swing to the side, nihilism, right, from 常见 to 断见 or thường經, 斷經, right? We swing from one extreme to the other, and we don't even recognize it. So we have existence and non-existence in our heads. We're fighting between these two extremes. We swing from one extreme to the other. In a sense, we are fighting a monster that does not exist at all. It only leads to more stress and eventually illness and depression, right? Some people believe that this stress is real, this monster is real, that it makes them become even more sick. And we have thought of this hateful stress ratified into something fixed and solid in our experience, right? So we believe that this stress is real, is solid, it truly exists. And then we have the thought of no stress. The removal of this stress ratified into an absence which we are very much want. So we have stress, we think it's real, and then we swing to the side, we wish to have no stress. Not at all. So wanting to have absolutely no stress is not an effective way to lead a life. So the better option is to learn how to deal with stress and to turn stress into positive motivation for advancement. Because when you have stress, you have pressure. Pressure produces movement, motivation, right? Because of stress, that it motivates you to overcome it. Not to wish that stress does not exist, but how to resolve stress. Does it make sense? Right? So because we have this subtle existentialism and nihilism in our mind that we can make our world a living hell. Right? We go from one extreme to the other. So we keep chasing after something that's absolute. Right? And either thinking that stress is real, one extreme, or wanting to have absolutely no stress at all, and as a result, unable to tolerate any stress. Does it make sense? So these two, when we talk about eternalism, nihilism, we think this is so remote. What has to do with me? But we are, without recognizing the two extremes, we are leading ourselves into suffering. So here is a really good example, right? Something that we don't like, and we think it really exists, and then we wish it does not exist. So we are swinging between the two extremes without knowing, and we cause troubles for ourselves. So how do we eliminate false view? False views are the precipitates and crystallizations of unskillful mental states, right? All the greed, anger, delusion, false speech, those things are unskillful, and they cause us to see things unclearly. So the most effective way of eradicating unskillful mental state is by practicing meditation. Meditation helps us to cultivate positivity. And it helps us to develop skillful mental states. And it helps us to raise a level of awareness. Because in the state of meditation, essentially it is an uninterrupted flow of skillful mental states of increasing purity and intensity, right? When you practice meditation, you recognize your unskillful and skillful mental states, and you try to resolve your unskillful mental state to preserve the positivity. And that's how you can have this uninterrupted flow of skillfulness. Covetousness can be eradicated with the help of recollecting of death, impurity, or 6 elements, or rejoicing in merits. We talked about this last time, so we won't repeat this. Delusion is, in a sense, ultimate source of false views, but also covetousness too. So any greed, anger, delusion, all those things will drive you to have false view because they drive you to swing from one extreme to the other. And so it helps us to reflect on conditionality, that things don't have this unchanging self. But they, and so to reflect on conditionality. So false views can also be abandoned with the help of Dharma study. Have a open-hearted discussions with those within the spiritual community who have emotional positivity and intellectual clarity that can help us to overcome our difficulties. False views, when we have false views eradicated, then our wisdom can shine through. Just like the clouds blocking the sunlight, it's delusion. But when our delusion is gone, the clouds, they disappear and they allow the sunlight to shine through. And so wisdom is the That's why wisdom is the positive counterpart of abstention from false views. I do want to cover one more thing here. Okay. Okay, just another example to help us understand this false view. When we have this, the thinking of when we think that something exists permanently, then that's false view. So the Buddha's teaching of anatta, meaning no fixed, unchanging self, is designed to undercut any assumption that there is a permanent self. It's also designed to undermine our ordinary habit of thinking of ourselves as a fixed identity, like me, myself, and I, separate from others. When we see that there is a fixed entity, then there is a real problem. It's a problem that cannot be resolved in a sense because it's fixed, it's unchanging. So in the ordinary unawakened state, the familiar sense of I, myself, mine, me, amounts to an ignorant grasping onto the constituents. In other words, we have these 5 skandhas, right? Wu Yun, Ngu Am. We have the form, feeling, perception, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness. Say, sắc, thọ, tưởng, hành, thức. Sơ, shou, xiang, xing, shi. Sắc, thọ, tưởng, hành, thức. So all these 5 constituents, they're not real, but we see ourselves as one entity. For example, we hear the sound of some persons that we don't like. But that sound is just sound. But the voice of that person that we don't like, we think that is something that is permanent because it triggers some unpleasant feeling in us. So therefore, when we hear it, it causes unpleasantness, unpleasant feeling. And therefore, we want to avoid that person. We don't want to see that person. But we don't recognize that that person consists of the 5 skandhas, right? Ngu Am, the 5 constituents. So the sound is, we think that that sound is real, that is permanent, that is single entity. So we believe that the sound that we hear is real, and it makes us feel unpleasant, and which we think is real. So the perception ahead of the person that we hate seeing is also real. So the sound that we think is real, therefore we think that the person that we hate is also real. And therefore we have this unskillful feeling, unskillful perception, and unskillful volition. So in other words, we have the intention to avoid that person, and therefore we create this unskillful karma. So does it make sense? So when we see somebody that we don't like, we are attached to the extreme view of existentialism, eternalism, 常见, thường kiến. We think that that person truly exists, and therefore when we hear the sound that we think of that person, we believe that the sound is real because we believe the person is real, but the person is made up of only 5 constituents. And therefore we cause rise to unskillfulness. Does it make sense? It isn't really me who does not want to meet that person that we hate, but it's just a strong aversion happening. It's if aversion, we want to run away. It's our feelings that's driving us to believe that that person is real. So we should ask ourselves, do we want to live our lives like this, believing in our strong emotions, whatever the cost to our dignity? Why not start to let go, face up to life, trusting in our values and commitment to truth? So we see that this ego is very deep-seated in our mind. that we don't normally have awareness of. And that's why it's difficult to recognize this, the experience of anatta, right? Anatta is no fixed and changing self. But when we can recognize that, we see through our minds this magical illusion, right? This sound that we hear is not coming from somebody who is truly like it's one single entity that truly permanently exists, but it just conditionally exists. It just conditionally exists. It is only when we reach the state of knowing and seeing reality, then we will be able to see the self for what it is. So the teachings of the non-self represents directions or and implications of conditionality. So the not self or the non-unchanging self is really conditionality. Our task is to bring creative states of mind into being, right? To not run away, to not be afraid of our feelings, and to not ignore them, but to utilize them to be creative, to learn why is there fear so that we can overcome fear. And when we overcome fear, we will have happiness, joy, because there is no fear. So there is less sense of an I or me in trying to get somewhere, though at the same time more of a sense of clarity and purpose. We understand why we do things. We understand what is happening to us and the feelings that we have, the perceptions that we have, and the motivation behind it. So when we understand the extreme views and we understand conditionality, it helps us to see things clearly, that we don't create this fear, we don't create this monster out of our imagination. Okay. Our reactive tendencies become established as habits when we keep enacting them out of basic ignorance. We keep on reacting to it. We keep on responding to it without knowing why, and therefore we reinforce this tendency to react. And we don't see that we are swinging between the two extremes and causing confusion and suffering for ourselves. So with ignorance as condition arise the formations of body, speech, and mind. We don't understand the motivation behind why we do unskillful things, why we have fear. So not aware of how dukkha arises, we act from greed, hatred, and delusion. And these actions become formations in both passive and active sense. Once it has become a bad habit, it is very difficult to overcome because it has now become the very fabric of our being. And that's why it is so difficult to change our bad habit. For example, like chain smokers. They understand, they know that cigarettes are bad for them, bad for their health, but they cannot stop themselves because it's too overpowering, right? So, but on the other hand, if you can train yourself and make skillfulness as your habit, then you are on your way of no regression, because your formation, your momentum is so strong that it is difficult for other things to slow you down, right? So it works both ways. We understand the two extremes to avoid reinforcing the bad habits. Because once, like I said, once it becomes a bad habit, it is very difficult for us to overcome the bad habits. Be mindful of your deeds, actions, and thoughts, right? Observing the 10 precepts, it's not restriction, but it's really to be free from physical and to be free from physical restrictions. When we observe the 10 precepts, we find positivity in our being, in our existence. And when we observe the precepts, we are trying or learning how to communicate effectively with others without confusing other people. And when we observe the 10 precepts, we cultivate meditations and wisdom, right? We don't allow our passive state to take over us. Our existence consists of our passive state and active state. Passive state are actions that are formed by our previous deeds. And our active state is how we create this pattern of life for our future, right? Things that happen to us, that's passive. But things that we do to create our future is passive. So when we act from generosity, love, and wisdom, we not only develop positive characters, habits, but also undo our more fixed and reactive tendencies. Right? So observing the 10 precepts, again, is not restriction, but to cultivate positivity and spiritual liberation. This may sound nice, really nice and ideal, and we may not be able to perfectly perform these 10 precepts, but what's more important is that we have this attitude, this positive receptivity, and we should be willing to give it a try, right? It's really, in a way, it's a way of being kind to ourselves, right? We should do things that can help us lead to a better future, and not to see that 10 precepts as something that restricts us. But you should see these 10 precepts as a way to uncover the path towards spiritual liberation. Again, this may sound ideal, but we should put in the best effort to cover the best ground, to have the best chance of success, is to have this positivity, this positive receptivity for the higher state of being. Okay, so that wraps up the 10 precepts, and we will move on with the Amida Sutra next time. Let's do merit dedication. If you could join your palms together, we recite, "May the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss.